Okay, as I mentioned in the last podcast, there are four major groups of organic compounds, four groups of chemicals, large, complex chemicals that build the things of which you are made, that build a living thing, okay? And those groups of living things, okay, those groups of compounds are carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids, okay? All of these are organic compounds, and they have four different groupings of them. The first grouping we're going to talk about is this one, carbohydrates, okay? So that's where we're headed with this podcast, is carbohydrates only. Now, the first thing we're going to do is just focus on what carbohydrates actually do. And you may already know this. If you're a runner, you might be aware that carbs provide energy. You eat carbs before a swim meet or something like that. Carbohydrates are a source of energy. They are a source of quick or immediate energy for a living thing. They are also a way to store energy for long-term use later on. For example, in plants, we can also use them in our bodies to store energy, so energy storage in animals. And carbohydrates can be used as structural or building compounds for support, almost like a skeleton, but not our skeleton. Our skeleton is not made of carbohydrate, but a support structure like in a plant's body, for example, that supports a plant and keeps it upright. Okay, so those are the functions of carbs. You need to first and foremost think energy, okay? Energy storage, quick, immediate energy, and then secondarily think building structures, structural compounds for support. All right, now, as we already know, the idea for all organic compounds is that you have little building blocks that we call monomers. So each of these little rectangles here would be a monomer, 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 monomer. And the whole group of them connected together like that is a polymer, okay? And each bond in between the little subunits is a covalent bond. Okay, now if we are specifically talking about carbohydrates, then if we are just talking about carbs, okay, then we can specifically name these monomers. All carbohydrates are built of monomers, small subunits that we call monosaccharides, and that means one sugar. Okay, so each of these little squares, now if we're specifically talking about carbs, we can give it a specific name. These are monosaccharides, okay? So each monosaccharide is an individual car in the carbohydrate train, all right? And when we link them all together, as I've done in this picture, we call the whole thing linked together a polymer, but specifically we can call it a polysaccharide. Poly meaning many, and saccharide meaning, again, sugar. So many sugars would be a polysaccharide, a special type of polymer, okay? So that's the whole choo-choo train. So what we're going to do now is go into some detail about the little subunits, the monomers, monosaccharides. So, monosaccharides are the monomers of all carbohydrates, the building blocks. They are called simple or single sugars, okay? The basic formula for all monosaccharides is this CH2O for every, first of all, in monosaccharides are all carbohydrates. There are only carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens. That's it. There's no other elements. And for every single carbon, there's always 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen. Okay? So that's the basic formula. For example, the most famous monosaccharide there is a monosaccharide called glucose. This is the fundamental sugar that living things use. Its chemical formula, I'm going to write it correctly because this I didn't write it properly here, is C subscript 6 H12O6. So what you can see is for every single carbon, there's twice as many hydrogens. So if there's 6 carbons, there's 12 hydrogens and 6 oxygens. C6H12O6. That's what glucose chemical formula is, and you should know it. Okay. This is how glucose actually looks. I mean, understanding this is still not, it's too small to see and it's not made up of little letters, but this is how the atoms are arranged. And what you can see is that carbons, the 6 carbons, are arranged in a ring like this. 6 carbons in a ring with covalent bonds connecting them to each other. And then there's this 1 carbon that's kind of stuck up here in the air all by itself. And then the carbons, remember, they have 4 hands to hold. They're a great little tinker toy. It's holding hands here with the two other carbons, but it's holding hand up here with this OH group and hands here with this hydrogen. And you can see there's lots of hydrogens surrounding these carbons and also these OH groups that are surrounding the carbons. Okay? Now, glucose is the sugar that is made by plants when they are doing photosynthesis. So we've talked about the photosynthetic equation where sunlight plus carbon dioxide plus water is going to give us glucose sugar. Well, there it is. Okay, this is the very sugar that plants make. Okay, there are other monosaccharides as well. So glucose isn't the only one. There's a monosaccharide called galactose, which we see in milk. There's fructose that we see in fruit, and there's others as well. Monosaccharides, simple sugars. All right. Now, monosaccharides are incredibly important because the energy in monosaccharides can be made available very quickly to living things. If you eat glucose, you've got an instant energy source, okay? Now, where is this energy in this molecule? Energy is stored in the chemical bonds of all molecules, but sugar molecules are especially good at storing energy in their chemical bonds, okay? In particular, the bonds that exist between carbon and hydrogen atoms are capable of storing lots of energy, okay? You don't really need to know why carbon-hydrogen bonds are so good at storing energy. Just understand that if you've got a carbon bound to a hydrogen, that bond, if it is broken, can release lots of energy. It is the breaking of those bonds. So the bond represents stored energy. When the bonds are broken, the energy is released, okay? And that energy is available to use for living things. The process, which we've talked about, photosynthesis makes these kinds of bonds and stores them in a glucose molecule. Cellular respiration basically takes these bonds and breaks them. We've talked about cellular respiration being the opposite of photosynthesis. Here is another way in which it is the opposite of photosynthesis. It is taking these bonds and breaking them to get the energy out to be able to use it. Okay? So, if we look at this glucose molecule a little more closely, we can see that there's a whole lot of these carbon-hydrogen, 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 carbon-hydrogen bonds. Okay? There's a whole lot of them. That's why glucose and other sugars are good at storing energy, okay? Or providing energy, I should say. Each bond has a lot of potential energy in it, and so each glucose molecule has lots and lots of potential energy in it. And so when you break down glucose, you get energy very quickly, all right? Now, There's another type of sugar molecule called a disaccharide, okay? We are going to add a couple of monosaccharides together, a double sugar, if you will, two monosaccharides joined together, okay? Examples of disaccharides. One is sucrose, good old table sugar that you use regularly on your cereal or whatever. Sucrose is made up of two monosaccharides. One of them is called glucose, which we already know about. The other is fructose. You stick them together with a little covalent bond. Here's my glucose. Here's my fructose. Two monomers, stick them together. Now I have a disaccharide. Okay, lactose is another famous disaccharide, which is found in milk, and that is made up of the monosaccharide galactose and glucose stuck together. Okay, boom, boom, and that is what's found in milk. Okay, disaccharides are also useful for different reasons, slightly. They still provide energy, but they are not quite as easily broken down as monosaccharides. If your body sees glucose, it devours that, because that's the ready energy source for a living thing, okay? But disaccharides, when you have a disaccharide, you've thrown in an extra chemical bond that has to be broken before that sugar can be used for energy. You've got to break these two monomers apart before they can be used. And what that means is that disaccharides are usable by plants and animals to temporarily store sugar so they won't be just immediately consumed by the living thing. For example, disaccharides are used as a transport mechanism for sugar in plants. Think about this. Sugar's made in the leaves of a plant. We've got our big tree here and our big old trunk, and the sugar is made up here in photosynthesis in the leaves, but it's got to make it all the way down the plant and get stored in the roots so that the plant will have some energy later on in the roots. Well, if that glucose goes down the plant, it's going to be gobbled up, because that glucose is the ready consumable energy source for the plant. So what the plant does is it sticks glucose molecules together in the form of this disaccharide. Whoops, let me not go forward with that yet. Such that it can be transported down. The plant can't quite break it down so quickly because it's got to break down this extra chemical bond in order to consume it. So we move this on down the plant safely without it being consumed. A similar thing happens with animals. Milk is made by mammals, and it's made for babies, not grown-ups, okay? But if this cow can make milk for babies, if it were usable by adults, they might be trying to get it too. What we know is that most adult mammals, and I should have mammals because mammals are the only animals that make milk, mammals cannot digest milk, okay? If you have heard of lactose intolerance, that is actually the normal state for most mammals. They can't digest milk sugar. Why? Because most mammals, most adult mammals, lack the enzyme that breaks down that chemical bond in lactose. Baby mammals have it, because they're the only ones that are supposed to be drinking the milk in the first place. Adult mammals don't. They need to be off eating grass or whatever it is that they eat. So it makes milk harder to digest in mammals, so that adult mammals can't digest it. Baby mammals can, okay? So that means that milk is going to be saved for the young only. All right. Now, polysaccharides, many sugars joined. So this is the way that energy is stored long term is in the form of polysaccharides. Okay, there are several types of polysaccharides that are important, but the most important one that we're going to be talking about is starch. Okay, plants store energy in the form of starch. Okay. Basically, all in the world that starch is a bunch of glucose molecules linked together in a chain. So it is nothing more than glucose, 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 glucose. And we've got covalent bonds linking all those monomers, all those monosaccharides together. That's it, okay? Animals cannot make starch. Animals cannot make starch. Animals can't store energy in the form of starch, but they can certainly digest starch and use the energy that is stored in it, okay? Now, if I show you a starch molecule, this would basically be a starch molecule. A glucose connected to a glucose, connected to a glucose, connected to a glucose, okay? And what I want to emphasize to you, remember we said that sugars are a good source of energy because look, there's a carbon, hydrogen, carbon, hydrogen, carbon, hydrogen, carbon, hydrogen, carbon, hydrogen, carbon, hydrogen. There's a lot of energy available in this one molecule. Well, think of it. If a plant is gluing together bunches of these, then it's going to have a ton of stored energy, okay? And they can hold on to that energy to use later when they are not able to do photosynthesis or whatever, and they can use that energy to get them through. Now, we cannot make this stuff. We cannot make starch, but we can sure as heck eat it, and we can sure as heck use all these carbon-hydrogen bonds that are in all these molecules as energy for our cells when we break them, when we digest them. Okay? So, here's the idea, again, of starch. You've got a bunch of glucoses that then get linked together. We find starch in things like bread because we make bread from grain that is basically a bunch of stored starch from plants. Potatoes are stored starch. When you go and you grab a potato, that potato plant has been working all summer long to hold its leaves up to the sky and make glucose and store that glucose in the form of starch. Then you, being the big bully you are, you go and grab the potato and eat the starch for yourself. Okay? Rice, things like that. All of those things are great sources of starch. Okay? Now, there is another type of polysaccharide called glycogen. This is the one that you can make and all animals can make. Okay? It is the way that animals can actually store energy in the form of a carbohydrate. This is not our main energy storage form, okay? Animals use fat a lot more, but fat's not a carbohydrate. What we're talking about right now is carbohydrate. And we can store a little bit of energy in our bodies in the form of a carbohydrate called glycogen. Now, glycogen is real similar to starch. It is made and found in the liver, mostly, okay? It also, just like starch, is made of lots of glucose molecules linked together. It looks chemically almost exactly like starch. There is a slight difference in the way they're bound, and that's it. So, as you consume sugar, okay, you use that sugar to do things, okay? You use the energy in that sugar to do things, but your liver will convert some of it into glycogen and store it for a period of time, okay? For example, if you right now went and ate your sandwich, your body would break that down and you'd have glucose. If your body was unable to temporarily store some of that glucose, basically you'd eat your sandwich and you'd be like, ah! You'd have this great rush of energy and then you'd collapse. What your body does instead is it uses some of that energy right away, but the rest of it, it will temporarily store in your liver in the form of glycogen molecules. The glycogen molecules, like I said, look a whole lot like starch. There's a subtle chemical difference in the way they're linked together. But what will happen is your body will store it like this, okay? And then throughout the day, as you find you need a little energy, it'll clip off a glucose and say, here you go. And it'll clip off another. Here you go. Clip off another. Here you go. as you need energy throughout the day, so that you will have a little energy source throughout the day. You basically have about a day's worth of glycogen stored in your liver at any point in time. So this is not going to last you. If you go a day without food, you're going to get rid of your glycogen stores, and then you're going to have to rely on fat as your energy source until you eat again. Okay? All right, this is what glycogen looks like. You can see that it really is just basically glucose is stuck together, but the way they are stuck together is a little bit different chemically. You can see that they're kind of branching from each other instead of just a straight chain, and so you get this kind of branching pattern. That's the only difference. Don't worry about that too much. Remember, it is made and stored in your liver. Okay. Finally, there's one other type of polysaccharide, and that is called cellulose. This is not for energy typically. Okay. It is the structural carbohydrate in plants. Basically, it too is lots of glucose molecules linked together. You ought to see a pattern occurring. Glucose is linked together. But again, they are linked in a particular way that is not digestible by animals. It's not digestible by plants. And so it's a sturdy, rugged support compound. It makes up the cell walls in plant cells. Okay. It is for support and protection of the plant cells and thus the plant. It is undigestible by animals. It is basically wood. Cellulose is basically wood. So what you're seeing here, that tree trunk, is a bunch of cellulose. The leaves of the trees, the cell walls are cellulose. You have to, if you're an herbivore, you've got to be able to break that cellulose down. And most animals can't do that by themselves. Usually they have to have bacteria in their gut to help them do that. Okay? One last polysaccharide is called chitin. I know everybody's going to see that word and want to call it chitin, but it's chitin, okay? It is also a structural carbohydrate. It is used to build the cell walls in a fungus, but interestingly, it also is the very same thing that builds the exoskeleton in an arthropod, like an insect or a crayfish or a crab or something like that. So when you eat your mushrooms on your pizza, just remember you are also eating the very same thing that makes the cricket go crunch when you step on it. Okay, that's not a cricket, by the way. I'm not really sure what that guy is. All right, that does it for carbohydrates. We are headed to lipids next, but not today. All right, thanks for watching. I will catch you in the next podcast. Take it easy.